Hi there. My name is Peg Hosky from Fed Insider. And on behalf of Vion, Hitachi Vantara, and Fed Insider, I'm pleased to welcome you to our educational webinar on data integration and analytics. Before we begin, we have a few polling questions that we'd like you to answer so our speakers can fine-tune their remarks. Be sure to type in any questions in the Q&A pod on the left of your screen, and we'll try to answer your questions during the webinar. Also, please take note of the resources button on the left side of your screen to download today's slides and other informative materials. We have a jam-packed discussion today, so without further ado, let's begin. First thing I'd like to do this morning is I'd like to be able to turn over to each of our presenters the opportunity to give us a little more details about their background. So to start that off, let me turn this over to Rob Davies.
Thank you, Peg. Gordo, Mark, thanks for being with us today to talk about analytics and policy and real-world applications. I think we're in for a very good discussion. I've spent my entire career in federal IT, supporting federal customers and state and local customers. I should say public sector IT. And, you know, I've gone through a couple of different eras, I guess, from the mainframe era to the distributed era, and now we're in the cloud and analytics era. And I think many of the processes and policies that we started in the distributed era and total quality systems and things like that, you know, I see customers trying to revisit around cloud, and I don't think they need to revisit some of those governance structures, particularly when it comes to analytics. I think they need to just adapt them a little bit. But, you know, that's one of the interesting things I see all the time. People want to try to create, again, what they've already created. And I think we need to trust what we've all built in our market together. So anyway, a lot of time in federal IT, and I'm pleased to be here with you all talking about analytics. Mark?
Excellent. Gordo, can you jump in?
Certainly. Thanks, Peg and Rob. So you see there on the screen that I've been around for a few years and worked, besides at a number of OEMs and vendors, various resellers, and also worked in the IC community. Before I came into the IT space, I was actually a cryptologic airborne Russian linguist. And it's interesting speaking with people today in the field in various DoD and IC missions to really understand what their need is when it comes to data analytics. And I think back to all those times I was in the aircraft, and it was back then, and that's been a few years ago, so I'll have to admit that. Then it was a matter of pen to paper and tapes and things like that. But the mission was the same as it is today. And I think of the capabilities and the what we can do with the technology that we have today. And as I was in the active reserves for a number of years, while I was actually in the IT space as well, it was always interesting to go back into the units and start to apply some of the things that we were using in the IT space. So that's always a challenge, and it continues to be a challenge with the different policies and directives that are mandated today. So I look forward to having this conversation, and I think you'll find that it's very relevant for most of the mission situations that we find ourselves in today.
Thanks so much. Mark, tell us a little bit about you.
Well, I'm a bit different because I don't necessarily come from the IT space. I would consider myself a technologist, but I'm an acquisition professional that works in the acquisition community, and I lead the efforts to manage and govern acquisition data. The role we play is pretty much the tools and techniques of data management, as you might see in an operating chief data officer or a chief data officer. We do those types of chores because our role is to help lead the department in managing data so we can get it to the secretary and undersecretary, as well as lead the department efforts to bring that data into alignment. The parlance we usually use is data governance, and then provide access and authoritative information, as well as new tools and techniques to help the organization make better decisions with that data.
Fantastic. I'd like to move on then to our next slide and have Rob, would you talk through just quickly what we're going to discuss today?
Sure, absolutely. So today's objectives for learning really, I think, follow a path that we've done on other webinars for those that have been on with us in the past. But so we're going to start off talking about some of the policy drivers and policies rather that are shaping how we deploy analytics and AI and what we want to get from those deployments. Then talking about, okay, what's the how, right? How do we do that? What are some real world examples? And then lastly, what are some of the buying strategies that can help us get those technologies and capabilities supporting the mission set or supporting the business in the way that the agency requires.
Excellent. I'd like to now pull Mark into the discussion and have him talk about really some of the policy initiatives that he's dealing with at the Department of Defense. Mark, you've got about 6 or 7 minutes. Can you talk through this for us?
Well, as we talked about in the pre-call, you could probably talk about this for about 3 weeks, but I'll try to summarize what I see from my perspective. It's not just the policy. I want to say that, though, too. The government really has looked and seen an awful lot of commercial best practices emerge regarding the management use of data to solve various problems across, frankly, the universe. But you could see the policy and the legislature and the laws that have come out over the past 4 or 5 years that have really tried to focus each federal space on using and managing their data better, to adopt new strategies and technologies. And the legislative agenda, if you look across the breadth, is frankly quite broad, whether it comes out of the CIO organizations, whether it comes out of the acquisition communities, or whether it comes out of the chief data officer communities. A few years ago, I participated in the first ever Chief Data Officer Data Cabinet, where we tried to sort through this because you could see executive orders on artificial intelligence, you could see Open Government Act, specifically in the department, you could see digital engineering, you could see us in acquisition had legislation in the National Defense Authorization Act over 3 years focusing us on data and solving that. When I participated across the federal space, and as well internally, you really have to establish yourself a position to meet these laws. Because clearly, if you look back beyond the specifics of the legislation, they're really trying to get the departments to focus on using data to make better decisions. And in the Department of Defense case, and I can speak for a very narrow area specifically, but looking at it broadly, we are a big department. And that legislation affects an awful lot of us. And whether we're talking about operations or whether we're talking about business data, all these things are common and true. And there's a couple, 3 things that are on the chart that really mention it. It's understanding the data stewardship and the data stewardship and how data can inform what problem you're trying to solve. How you obtain access to all the data. Frankly, we spend a lot of money on data and data management. We have an awful lot of data. How do we exploit the data we have for the mission area? And then lastly, you can see that data science and artificial intelligence, new tools and techniques, both managerial as well as technologically, have emerged over these past 10 years, where technology has really sped innovation, and our management practices have to adapt for that too. And with that, that means our workforce has to adapt too, and understanding what these terms are, why they work that way. I would say the Hill is quite interested in us in improving, and in fact, our specific legislation on National Defense Authorization Act of 18, Section 913, specifically talks about us improving our data management to improve acquisition outcomes. Now, what does that mean? If you look at it from the largest programs over a fit-up, you're talking about $1.7 trillion worth of investment. If you look at it from programs, that's about 100 or so major weapon system programs. And if you think about it in the department where we get to smaller, albeit large nonetheless, acquisition category 2, 3, and 4 programs, you're talking about maybe 3,000 to 4,000 programs where you really want to exploit the data and help the program managers be better acquirers and stewards of those programs.
Excellent. And now I'm going to turn over to Rob and Gordo. We've got another topic we'd like to talk about that moves ahead from the initiatives and talks about some of the key concerns and challenges that DoD faces in balancing these acts. So can I ask you two to talk about that for me?
Sure. So as Mark said, you've got a pretty heavy regulatory environment and a lot of desire and drive to use the data to be more effective in how we support those missions, both on the federal side and on the vendor side. And obviously, we have to be very sensitive to those, right? I mean, the executive orders that are signed as each new administration comes in, and you have those policy changes. But I think the end remains the same. The means may adjust a little bit, but they still ultimately want to get a better product. And I think, as Mark also touched upon it, right, the DoD is so large that it's not always a one size fits all. So you want to have the ability across the breadth of what the DoD mission is to make those adaptations in those directives, because what the DLA needs to do is different than what parts of the Air Force need to do, and maybe they need to share some of that same information. I mean, you can imagine, Gordo, in your background, the mission set that you supported, right? Like, what would that have been like if you could have had edge analytics right in the aircraft?
That thought comes to me quite often, actually.
And then the bandwidth to actually get that information and have some real-time feedback on it from analysts somewhere else. And those are some of the practical things that I think about, but they also present some of the challenges, because you've got, you always have security challenges in IT, but then you've got some regulatory challenges that we need to address, because certain information isn't allowed. It would make maybe it's sort of common sense that this data set should be available to everybody, but it isn't.
Right.
So how do we work around that? And then I also think there's the unfortunate turf aspect, which always comes into play in IT, and the I call it IT religion, this set or that, when the product sets are
do things a certain way,
right,
or don't do them at all.
And there's certainly some validity to investments that have been made in training and things like that. But those are what I think are some of the concerns, and we all have to think about what we're trying to accomplish and what makes sense. So we need the regulatory thing to evolve. But as I said, if you've had something like that, or if you're I guess the descendants supporting that mission now, not that you're too old, Gordo, but I can say that Gordo and I have known each other a long time, but it just would be a dramatic change in how we do things, I think.
It would, and I think at this level, and to draw back to some of what Mark said on the last slide too, something that gives me hope here when I read these policies, like the digital engineering strategy that has a graphic on the screen now, the thing that gives me hope is that when we go into an environment where people are they know that they need to put data analytics into play, and they have an idea about their data sets and what they're going to derive insights from. They approach it from that very low level. And what these policies speak to is really kind of the overarching data governance level. And I often ask people, the customers, to pull back and look at what other projects in their environment might also have similar requirements. And every day there are, when you go into a large government agency, there's no one department within that agency that stands alone with the need to do data analytics. They all need it today. And these policies are key to driving that. And it really opens up the door when we go in to have a conversation with the different mission components to let them know that it's okay to think about other departments. It's okay to ask if other people have a need to do something. And that's really spelled out in these policies today, and I think that's really key. The ability to reuse AI, artificial intelligence models, is key. Different machine learning models that are created by your data scientists, those can often be reused, and so you want to get yourself started with a set of tools that allow you to do that reuse. And the benefit of that reuse is that you start inspecting what your data pipeline looks like and your analytics pipeline, and you find out that you have a lot of things, a lot of data sources that you can pull in to benefit that overall insight that you're looking for. So what data scientists find a lot is that they had no idea that pulling in a different data source would derive a different insight, which could be a key insight. So it's always good to look to see what people are doing across your department, across your agency, and pulling them in to make these decisions. And this helps to quantify it and to qualify it in these policies.
Thanks a lot, Gordo. I want to step in for a second, Mark. I have another minute or two to talk on this topic, and I was wondering if you could talk about what the DoD is doing in terms of aggressive schedules with procurement. Are they able to push that procurement envelope to speed that acquisition process using data?
Well, I think it's one of the things that we try to do. And, I have to differentiate it because in the Department of Defense, we really differentiate between two terms. Procurement, which is the buying activity, which results in contracts, and the acquisition. And acquisition is generally on, it emanates from the community. And the question really is, can we acquire and meet threats and requirements faster than we once did? Our threats are ever evolving. There's many actions in many different parts of the process that can affect how quickly you acquire and how quickly you implement technologies. There is one recent, it may be a little bit more than a minute, Peg, and I apologize.
Yeah.
There's one recent legislative event that talked about the middle tier of acquisition, where in the acquisition community and led by the undersecretary, they're trying to figure out ways to implement technology and smaller programs in a defined increment within 5 years to go very quickly on the biggest and largest platforms of the department. The law was passed about a year ago, and it is not just the buying of it, it is the acquiring of it. So taking a need, and it has rolled the process down to the services, where the services are responsible for finding solutions to problems that they may have. And I would say we've gotten legislation in process too, not only technology. But there too, the question, and we've been working with the policy, there's an interim policy out from the department. But as the data side of the problem, we've also been working with them to manage the data effectively. So we would get appropriate insight without getting in the program and the services way of delivering capabilities. It is always a focus of being efficient and effective. And I think sometimes we just color whole process that it's bad. We're really trying to empower the program managers to meet the needs, because ultimately our gear and our services end up supporting a warfighter, and there's many facets to that discussion.
Excellent. If we could slip to the next slide, Gordo, I want you to just start us off with this and talk about some of the key challenges that you're seeing.
Sure. Thanks, Peg. So this particular topic is, I would say, kind of the required topic when we start talking about data, big data, analytics, and the data quality, the completeness, the reliability. Those all reach back into problem areas of accessing and ingesting and processing a lot of data. And so you've probably heard of the 3 V's of big data, being the volume, the variety, and the I want to say there are actually 5 V's.
Veracity.
Veracity is one of them, usually labeled number 4, and basically the speed at which you're getting this data in. Mm-hmm. So those areas are key to the set of tools that Rob just reminded me. The velocity, that's another word for speed. So, but it starts with a V, and that's important here. So thank you, Rob. So the reason that these are always challenging is that when you start looking at what you're going to analyze, you start with input sources, and you know that you want to derive some sort of analytical value from that, so some insight. The problem is that there's a lot that has to go on between those endpoints, and typically when you start a project, you know something about what your different variety of input sources is, and that's good. That's the place to start. What you typically find out is that all input sources are not what you necessarily thought they were to get started with, and so you have changes and you need flexibility in your plan. And flexibility is pretty much the key to all of this, because you're always going to end up deriving insights into your data before you get to your consumer, let's say. So you're going to find out that you have more than you thought. You're going to find out that it's either static or you have real-time needs, so streaming data, video feeds, audio feeds, things like that need to be analyzed. And you're going to have to prepare for all of that. And then you have to start thinking about, well, when I get past the point of modeling this data pipeline, this analytical pipeline, and get to the point of actually delivering your data and your analytics and your dashboards and things like that to your consumers, you might find that you don't have an infrastructure that scales to the point that allows you to do this in real time. So you have to make sure that from the beginning that you have the ability to scale up, scale out. Are you talking about doing this in a cloud environment? Do you have classification issues that require you to do this on-prem? Do you have vendors that can create a cloud-like environment on-prem as opposed to bursting into a government-sponsored cloud? What do you need to do? And then one of the things that comes into the overall data governance side of this that ties into this slide nicely is that you're going to find out that even if you're processing the data properly and you're deriving value, at some point you're going to figure out that you have a hell of a lot of data that you have to store somewhere. And you may not have counted on that. So you're going to have to burst out to cloud or burst out to cloud on-prem. So starting to look at different components of this data strategy, such as overall capacity and where your data lives, that's a key, all challenges here, I would say, around this. So what do you think, Rob? Does that
No, I think
make sense?
I think you've covered it well. I think you've certainly got a lot of real world experience that informs your guidance there. And I build on that and simply say that I think that we see customers in this space with analytics and AI, they not all. Some are, there are certainly agencies and spaces in the government that are pretty mature, but many are, it's in the lab, but they're looking at a specific use case and they're dealing with those, data source and data quality issues. And maybe they get to where they're deriving some results, but those results create, a human interrupt where something's revealed, the processing stops, or that causes humans to get involved.
Right.
And the whole point is that these derivations of data and these discoveries get put right back into the workload, right? The workload changes, right? The machine learning, it adjusts. That's the intelligence and artificial intelligence.
That's
or the artificial.
We really want, yes.
And that's where we want to go. So we want to get from that sandbox, into production with it. So, I think that definitely see progress. Definitely, we're on a good path, but I think there's still a lot to be done and a lot to consider because, you highlighted some of the significant challenges around the infrastructure and how it scales.
Yeah.
Good.
Never.
I'd like to pull Mark in just briefly on this topic. Can you talk about weapon systems, or do you have any issues with disparate data streams that you're involved with, Mark?
Yes, of course, everybody does. And I think I'm a bit more fortunate that we manage a bit by CIOT in our space because the services have to provide the data because, one, we dealt the deck from dealing with providing that data to Congress, and as well as making sure programs were properly resourced, properly monitored, properly decided upon. My best partners are the services, and I think depending on whatever space you are in, it is about the governance and the data management of working with where those authoritative sources of data are and making sure that we can have a common and shared vision. And that sometimes is rather difficult, and because everyone, you have silos, different perspectives of it, differing infrastructures. The integration has been a labor of love, and one of the technological techniques we've been using is let the data exist where it is, but if you're providing it to me, let's get semantic alignment between what you're giving me, do with it what you need to do, but when it gets here, it needs to mean this, and can we build that bridge? That is much more technique than it is technology. And that stewardship of trying to understand how those different sources and different locations within the services, because I can look at the services and they're going to have a different underpinning to them from every one of their PEOs, providing that bit of leadership and stewardship of that data has proven immensely successful. It doesn't mean you can solve the problem quickly. It just means you have a model to deal with what you're trying to solve.
Excellent. I think let's move on next. And I want to talk a little bit about some commercial best practices, some things that private industry is seeing in terms of artificial intelligence, data integration. So I'm going to turn this over to Rob for you to lead this part of the conversation, Rob.
Sure. Thanks, Peg. We, mentioned before about sort of trying to evolve out of the sandbox and move into production. And I think that's where some of the customers that we have in the commercial space, particularly in the financial vertical, really are moving into that production in many cases, right? Whether that's machine learning in their environment or that's algorithms around their investment strategies, they're heavily reliant upon those analytics to try to discern, patterns and benefits for themselves and their customers, captured in, that return on the investment and profitability and things like that. Items that we don't typically deal with in the public sector. But, I think the the ability to move those things into production, understand what the implications are for having it in production, and that we've got to let some of these systems, essentially with artificial intelligence, right? We've got to let them improve on their own. That's the whole point.
Right.
And then set up the guidelines for, okay, when do we stop? What's the monitoring? Because humans and governance always have to be involved. But it's not so much, I suppose, best practice. As I said, I think in the introduction, I think we've established, governance structures and governance best practices for IT programs and projects. Mark's role at DoD is, evidence of that, right? Just being able to sort through acquisition data to make acquisition more efficient and more effective for the warfighter and for the department in general. That's representative of best practice being done in DoD. But I think of it more in terms of really getting the return for an effective mission set in the public sector now, and starting to work more broadly, right? As you sort of alluded to, Gordo, you might have parts of a department where, yep, they're doing it, but how can that affect the rest of the department, and how can those investments that have been made in one particular section have been deployed across the rest of the department? And I think that's one area, right? And I think that's one area where, particularly in our customer set in the financial space, where we see some of that activity propagating across groups, and they're smart about how those investments are leveraged.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about this for us, Gordo? Do you have some comment here? And then I would like to pull in Mark as well.
I'll add a couple of things to what Rob said. As far as best practices, I definitely agree with Rob that AI, as much as we see it in the news and hear it and see it everywhere, we're not necessarily across the board realizing the promise yet of AI and machine learning. But we are certainly poised to realize that benefit. And one of the ways we get there is by, I guess what I want to say is we have to be ready, and we have to not stay too much in a single lane when we approach AI. And what I mean by that is that AI offers a lot of promise, and it is very new, and there are varying ways to accomplish AI and various stages of what might be considered AI, various levels. So you always have to keep an eye open, and the tools that you use have to allow for a bit of creativity. The different tools that I'm talking about might be that, AI is going to feed from ingesting some number of databases or big data sources and things like that. So as you ingest that, you want to make sure that as you're cleaning that, you're refining that, you're building models on it, that you have the ability to find out all along the way, basically visualize all along your data pipeline what exactly your data transformations are allowing for, and what overall insights you're going to derive from those. And if they aren't working out to your satisfaction, then you need to be creative enough, and your tools need to be agile enough to allow you to make changes without starting over again. And we see that in the kind of an end-to-end stewardship of data analytics tools that is very important, I think, to this point of best practices. You really need to make sure that your tool set is up to par and does not kind of paint you into a corner. So being able to plug in various AI models is key. Machine learning the same way. It's all part of being creative and doing that through flexibility.
Excellent. And Mark, I wonder if you could step in and help me out. I see artificial intelligence. I see machine learning. I'm not sure if they're the same thing. And also, can you talk about whether you're seeing any of those tools used for mission success in what you're doing?
All right, so I'm going to, across the department, the answer would be yes. In what we're doing, I would tell you we are positioning ourselves for that. But before I do that, I just want to take a little segue back to the best practices of data management.
Yeah, please.
One of the things that we talked about, in positioning yourself for machine learning or AI or AR or even deep learning, if we can ever get to that point, in our governance and in our documentation, we were very conscious about being transparent in the department on how we were governing, what our data models look like, what our data techniques look like, what our technical access or API strategies were, and all of our documentation was available to whomever in the department needed it. The model was there. I'm not going to solve every problem in the Department of Defense, but I think I can contribute to a good many of them with acquisition data. So how do we share and how do we manage? And I wanted to say that because that's part of the foundation when you get to AI and machine learning. And I come at it from a very different perspective because AI and machine learning and data analysis are all mechanisms. I always look at the mission because the answer is it depends. You wouldn't want to send a cruise missile if machine gun fire would do. Excel may be good enough in the analysis, and AI may get you an expense with not giving you any better solution than an analyst with an Excel spreadsheet. We've got to learn to understand how we position ourselves. And I'd like to talk to just a brief moment about data analytics first. Now that we had access to data, now that we knew the provenance of that data, and we knew the bias of the data, and the bias is critically important before you do any analysis. In our analysis of data science and putting things together, we were also transparent there of how we munged the data, how we applied data science, and we had operating models, and even making our R code available to the next person. Because maybe we didn't answer the question they wanted, but the data science. That technique in the space where I find myself is very new. It's deep in other sectors of where you have deep analytics and statisticians, but in my space, that's a lot of those techniques are new, so providing that. Putting machine learning may not be the best on my data sets or AI because we don't have the volume and velocity of data. It's moving at pretty much a glacial pace. Putting other data sets with mine, that may make an awful lot of sense. But the question you have to look at when you're applying these tools and techniques are the policies that affect that data. And if you are in a combatant commander, the decisions there you make may be very grave. And I think we're learning of how to grapple with using data for those decisions of how do you automate, targeting, and how do you work through that. But thank goodness that's not my space. In our space, we realize that we deal with very deep and complex data. There has to be a bit of transparency there. And if we're using machine learning or we're using artificial intelligence, there's going to be a demand of understanding the algorithms underneath. And I think we're going to be working through that for a number of years of figuring out how best to do that. My sense is there's no push button answer. There's no machine that gives you a perfect answer, and we're going to have to work through that for the next couple of years to get us to that point where we feel comfortable as humans and we feel adoptive of what solutions are being portrayed to us.
Excellent. I'd like to move on to the next section then, and this is a topic that I think is very much home to what Rob Davies can talk to as well as Mark. So let me start with Rob talking about some of these new flexible procurement vehicles and strategies.
Sure. That's something we've seen, having operated in this cloud space before we even had the terms cloud, Vion started with DISA in the DoD in the early 2000s, 2003, 2004 timeframe with utility capacity models for procurement. And I think for the next, from that time for the next 10, 12 years, it was really difficult to talk to other agencies about that model and what the benefits were, how they could actually accomplish it under current FAR guidelines. But in the last 2 years, with the policy directives, with the executive orders from multiple administrations about cloud and how to consider it, and culminating now in the current administration with Cloud Smart, we see a tremendous number of RFIs and the government really thirsty for information about, okay, how can we actually acquire things differently and acquire them as a service or acquire them in these cloud models and have them be flexible without violating, anti-deficiency clauses and things like that, and getting people into ratifications and, the bad spaces of procurement. Nobody wants to be there. So in general, I think the environment's gotten much more acceptive of different procurement methods and how those methods can be utilized to drive a more effective mission. Certainly, we've seen other transaction authority be used in the DoD that had some very specific origins, and maybe that got a little bit outside its swim lane, but you hear that talked about much more, and I think that's refreshing because the government should be testing these other methods and for what they're intended to explore new technologies. But I still think while it's a lot better than it was 4 years ago, I think it needs to get better because there are still many places where procurement officials don't want to do it that way or won't, or will just say, nope, can't handle that procurement method, can't do it. Well, I've got 37 statements of work from, other agencies that have, or, 37 contracts, examples of how they've done it. So that gets back to, I think that there's, a lot of communication that still could occur across the acquisition community in the federal government, agencies that have a lot of maturity in that space, helping agencies that don't but would like to, understand how they do it, under what clauses, how are those solicitations structured, et cetera. So there's a lot more openness to it, but I think the mechanics still need to be taught across the entire federal government. And then, but that said, there are still a number of vehicles from the best-in-class identified sources that are specifically created for cloud. So they exist out there, whether that's, the NASA community, the NITAC NIH community, or GSA. They've got, broad government-wide acquisition vehicles that are purpose-built for cloud that can be accessed. And that's a fantastic development because these strategies can help you ease into it. They can help you utilize public cloud in that I think we now is a time-tested, although the time may only be 2 or 3 years, time-tested, test dev capability where sure. I can turn that on quickly. I can get familiar with this analytic or AI use case, and then I can make a determination whether I want to continue to run it there or I want to bring it on-prem and then allow myself to grow slowly into the capability with some type of as-a-service procurement, or make a decision that, I do want to buy it in the traditional method. It's just particular use case right. Argues for that. So in general, I'd say the environment is much more accepting. There's a lot more talk about it. The Cloud Smart initiative, I think, helps greatly. Again, the number of RFIs that I see for the government really yearning for information about how to do this. And, I looked at, there was recently one from DHS that taught, their cloud strategy and asking industry for comment. And then you look at the DoD cloud strategy paper that was put out maybe a month ago or 6 weeks ago. and there are just so many similarities between the two and what they're asking for, what their objectives are, and so I think it's got to continue to get better. I think this is going to be an acquisition strategy that is here to stay, and I think in 5 years from now, I hope that we'll see a sort of rebalancing of procurement that we've as a service is more the norm. It's how the government should acquire technology. So much of what is available in the technology space can be delivered almost as a commodity, and then you, in the government, the organizations have to adapt to become experts in how they resource that, right? We get away, I've said this a lot in previous webinars on cloud and stuff, but how we get away from the traditional three-tiered organizational structure, my systems administrators, my network administrators, and my storage administrators, right? And now I've got to have a cloud resource capability.
Right. I think one of the best things about what you just said is that you no longer have to describe what as a service means to people from the ground up.
That's true.
It's just known.
It is. That's a significant development. You're right, Gordon, over the last, I'd say, maybe even just 18 months.
The shorter time is that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Mark, this topic just flows directly into the next slide, and I'm wondering if you want to comment a little bit about acquisition or procurement, how you're seeing your data affecting some of the techniques that are being used now.
Well, it builds across, I guess, both spaces, from the procurements to, solving your problems. How do you get to data integration analytics and ultimately bring value to your organization? Broadly, there's an awful lot of initiatives and a lot of focus on this broadly across the department. And we're no different from them. We are all comparing notes and homework and trying to contribute to that in the big data environment. And, some of us have specific narrow and deep spaces. The real dialogue, and it kind of builds a bit off the procurement, and I'm not a contracting officer for 10 years, but in DPAP at one point, it's not just the buying and the procuring. It is really the value stream, and I see it, and yes, if we could all be enlightened across all spaces when somebody solved the problem, can everybody copy their homework and go? A lot of procurement professionals out there, yes, we should always strive to be better than what we are. But it's really a three-tier process. One is understanding the requirements and the needs. What are you really trying to solve? And getting to performance base and balancing that with the vendor base. And certainly there is the buying. And I don't know, a contracting officer for probably 15 years, there's a bandwidth of opportunities to solve different contracting problems. A bit dated on what they are, but I can remember using OTAs in the 1990s to buy software for a weapon system. Those tools and techniques have changed and modified, but you have to be able to see the whole part of it and being a business professional doing that. There's also one underlying, and it was touched on a bit. That's the technology backbones that we have to ride on. They too have got to be flexible. So, and I'll give you a couple specific examples. When I want to acquire some commercially best practices in software, and I write requirements and I go to market, and we go to market, and it takes me, 6 months to 12 months to get certification and deployment on these things, I'm no better than if procurement was slow. All the actors have got to perform efficiently and effectively, and everyone has a reason and a rationale, whether we're talking about security on the network or security of the software and or services. We're going to have to get better at doing that and keeping all things in balance. And there isn't a right answer, but we should learn how to do that better. And some of that requires a lot of hand touch on making sure that we get to that. Because the ultimate game here is not just buying the software or not even providing the data. It's solving real-world problems in the department. Whether we're trying to solve on how we can use data to make our processes faster, or how we can acquire weapon systems to make them get them to the field faster, how we can sustain them better, how they're better engineered, how they can meet threats that are emerging on the battlefield. We can never lose sight of the missionary, because whether we're talking process, whether we're talking data, all of this is infrastructure. The mission is where the king is. And I think I try to always be key on that is the focus point of what we're doing. And, for those that are government out there, to be courageous and challenge and make sure that we're right in buying and acquiring, not wasting taxpayers' money, and providing value to the missions that we're chartered with.
Excellent. I think we've covered our slide on transformation, unless, Gordo, you want to add something to that conversation right there. If not, I'd like to go ahead. If not, I'd like to move on to the next slide on key steps toward data integration and have you start there.
Let's move on. I think we have covered it fairly well. Yeah.
Gordo, can you comment on this for me?
So
these are some of the steps. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was just making sure that we were also looking at the right slide. So we're looking at
key steps, correct.
Yeah, I think we have. I kind of consider this slide a bit of a summary slide for what we've talked about all the way through. I think we certainly hit the multiple stakeholder strategy, the ability to move that some decisions and some of the costing and things across multiple departments, and then just the benefit of having an extra set of eyes, kind of validate what you're doing, and then saying how that might help a different department as well. On the scalable, financially flexible workload performance program, certainly the need as you start ratcheting up the inputs, the velocity, the volume of all of the data that you're looking at, regardless of, like Mark said, whether or not you're using all of that to come up to a certain decision, is certainly a point where you have to allow for performance. We can go through a data pipeline and think that we have something analyzed and something available for an informative dashboard. But if we can't scale that and we can't do that in a performance-oriented way, then the consumer of that information is not going to be pleased. So we have to be able to do that. And from tying this into the acquisition space, being able to do that, like Rob was mentioning, in the cloud or a cloud-like environment, whether it's on-prem or in a public cloud or a government-sponsored cloud, that's really key to being able to move up and down in that performance area. So scaling up, scaling out, and turning that off when you don't need to pay for it any longer. So everything that we know about cloud and the benefits of cloud from a cost perspective helps in that next bullet of reducing your total cost of ownership. And then the identifying mission-critical applications, I kind of smile at that one because being involved in a lot of large data center, and I pretty much consider that any government data center falls into that large bucket. You're typically not dealing with small problems in this space. It occurs to me that I'm thinking back to a certain customer that we were working a DR, a disaster recovery type of mission-oriented project on, and we went in and asked them, what are your mission-critical data sets? What are your mission-critical applications? And they said, well, all of them. And the first thing after that is, you have to smile and say, well, they can't all be mission-critical. And more today, we might tend to say that everything's mission-critical. But the point I'm trying to make is that there are differentiations between different applications and different data sets that we have to be cognizant of in order to, apply the right principles of data analytics. And I think Mark mentioned this as well, that maybe an Excel spreadsheet does just as good for a certain decision to be made as does, a hugely complex data pipeline with AI and ML applied. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. So I certainly agree with Mark in that case. And then the last bullet there around we want to partner with experienced industry leaders. That kind of goes back to the area of the multiple stakeholder first bullet, in that we have to share what we've done. We have to be able to depend on both partners in industry as well as other partners within the government, and look at what they've done and take their use cases and say how they're similar to what we need in our own environment, and let that experience benefit us. It's only going to get better from here.
Thanks so much. I wanted to make sure I had a couple of minutes left, which we do, just a couple 4 minutes left. So I want to ask Mark, can you give us some of your last 2-minute sage wisdom? And then I'll turn it over to Rob. So go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I hope I can be sage. I want to echo off those comments that Gordo was just talking about. I always use the term, this is group therapy for us. Depending on what side we're coming at it from, whether it's data management, data analytics, artificial intelligence, we're trying to improve whatever sector we're in and improving the environment. And I think it's most important that we maintain a degree of collaboration and learning and listening. It's just not about buying or selling software. It's about solving problems. It's not just about acquiring this. We're trying to solve problems. And I think as a community, and if your core facet is acquisition or technology or data management, we need to solve this as a community. And I believe the wisdom that I have for the recommendation is we need to continue a dialogue and learn about how to make this better. And if it's internally, it's making sure we're building bridges across all the functional communities that may be so inclined to say no. And if it's with industry, is learning from what they've done. Copy their homework, copy the perspectives, understand their perspectives so we can adopt technology and technique within the government to solve problems.
Thank you, Mark. And let me turn this over to Rob for your final thoughts before we close today. This has been an excellent, excellent dialogue.
Thanks, Peg. And I can't improve upon what Mark just iterated and how Gordo spoke about it. One thing I would relate is about as Mark said, that what problem are we trying to solve, and what are we trying to deliver to the customer? And we talk a lot about efficiencies in our space and trying to be more efficient. And I was in a panel with a DHS official who had a pretty stressful and important job in cybersecurity, and had been a career civil servant. And he said something about efficiency and how it was that it's nice to be efficient, but he said it's more important for us to be effective. Certainly within boundaries, but to be effective and make ourselves more effective. And I think that really speaks to what Mark was saying about, identifying the problem, having the solution, and then making sure that we can, get everybody involved in adopting that best practice, whether that's from a procurement or from a certification, a technology deployment, that we all stand up to, make it better and make it easier so we can get to that effective result for our customer.
Thank you so much. This has been a fascinating and insightful conversation. I do want to remind our participants that they can log back in to download a transcript in the next day or two. We have the slides under the resources button right on your screen right now, as well as some other insight. There's a lot of other webinars in the works, so come to fedinsider.com DoD.com to register, and please do answer our survey so we can improve. Thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you the next time.